Let me start by saying this. Wade Robson once spoke in Michael Jackson's defense during the 2005 case, taking the stand when the world was already split in two about who Michael really was. But long before courtrooms, headlines, and televised trials, there was another story unfolding in the background. Gary, Indiana. Late 1960 S. A cramped house on a worn-out street, filled with noise, tension, and the kind of silence that makes your stomach knot. Inside that house, a young boy named Jermaine Jackson stood shoulder to shoulder with history before anyone realized history was being made. He sang next to a child who would go on to become the most famous pop star on the planet, watched the spotlight slide just a few inches away from him, and learned early that being near greatness does not mean you will ever share in it. As the years passed, Jermaine did not slip behind because he lacked talent, drive, or loyalty. He slipped behind because he stayed when others were ready to leave, because he believed that family duty and silence would somehow protect him. At 71 years old, Jermaine Jackson is not widely seen as the brother who failed, but as the brother who survived long enough to watch everything fall away slowly. This is not a story about simple jealousy or petty rivalry. It is a story about proximity, sacrifice, and the quiet tragedy of standing next to a legend while the world walks past you. A childhood built on fear and duty. To understand why the tragedy of Jermaine Jackson feels so unbearable at 71, you have to go back to the beginning, to a place where fear showed up before love and duty took the place of childhood. December 11, 1954. Gary, Indiana. A cold industrial city shaped by steel mills, factory whistles, and gray winter skies. Jermaine Jackson is born into a family where, according to many accounts, love is measured in performance and survival depends on obedience. From the moment he is steady enough on his feet to stand without shaking, it is as if his life stops belonging entirely to him. The Jackson household, people later said, was not a home in the traditional sense. It was more like a training ground overseen by Joe Jackson, a father whose authority, by numerous reports, was enforced with belts, harsh words, and fear. Mistakes were said to be punished physically. Praise was rare, conditional, and withdrawn as quickly as it appeared. In that environment, childhood barely exists. There are no lazy weekends, no safe corners to hide in, no room for softness or weakness. There are only rehearsals that stretch deep into the night, fingers burning on guitar strings, voices hoarse from take after take, and the constant understanding that failure will be met with pain. Jermaine learns early that crying makes things worse, that asking questions invites trouble, and that silence is safer than honesty. While other children his age are figuring out who they are, Jermaine is figuring out what he can survive. By the late 1950s, music in the Jackson home is no longer a hobby. It is an obligation. Jermaine is pushed into rehearsals before he fully understands what it means to perform. When his voice turns out to be strong and steady, Joe places him at the front. Jermaine becomes the first lead singer of the group that will soon be called the Jackson 5, not because he dreams of bright lights and screaming crowds, but because he is consistent, disciplined, and less likely to crack under pressure. He sings because he is told to sing. He performs because in that house, refusing is not a real option. In those early years, Jermaine carries the weight of responsibility long before he has any real sense of self. That responsibility hardens into something permanent inside him. He begins to believe his worth comes from keeping things together, from doing what is required without complaint, from absorbing pain so others do not have to. Then there is Michael Jackson, younger, smaller, more fragile, and frighteningly gifted. Jermaine watches Michael's talent surface, not as a miracle, but as a warning sign, because he sees what it triggers in their father. Joe's fixation intensifies. His standards rise. His punishments, according to various accounts, become more unpredictable. When Michael misses a note or hesitates in rehearsal, the anger can turn explosive. This is where Jermaine's role begins to crystallize. He steps in. He takes the blame. He creates distractions. More than once it was said that Jermaine physically positioned himself between Joe and Michael, letting the fury meant for his younger brother land on him instead. He doesn't do it for applause. He doesn't do it to be praised as a hero. He does it because someone has to, and in his mind that someone is him. You could say this is the first tragedy of Jermaine Jackson's life. It happened so early that he never even names it as tragedy. While Michael is allowed to remain the prodigy, the dreamer, the child whose gift must be guarded at all costs, Jermaine becomes the guardrail. He is trained to swallow jealousy before it has time to grow, to replace ambition with duty, to measure success not by how brightly he shines, but by how effectively he prevents disaster. In the hierarchy of the Jackson family, Michael is the future. Jermaine is the buffer. He is the one who keeps the machine moving smoothly, even if the gears grind him down in the process. As the years go by and the group starts performing locally, then regionally the pressure only gets heavier. The family's reputation grows, and with it Joe's control. Jermaine becomes hyper-aware of every slip, every missed step, every lapse in discipline, because he knows punishment doesn't always fall on the one who made the mistake. He learns responsibility before identity, loyalty before self-worth. By the time the Jackson 5 begin attracting serious attention, Jermaine has already absorbed a dangerous belief that his purpose is to serve something bigger than himself, even if it costs him everything. He does not dream of running away. He dreams of holding the line. By the late 1960s, when Motown comes calling and the Jackson 5 are poised on the edge of global fame, Jermaine is still a child in age, but not in spirit. He has been conditioned to endure, to obey, to protect. Outsiders read these traits as maturity and strength. What they cannot see is the emotional bill that comes with it. Jermaine has never been allowed to ask who he wants to be. He has only been told who he is required to be. When the cameras finally begin to lock onto Michael, when the world starts recognizing the youngest brother as something rare, almost otherworldly, Jermaine doesn't complain. He does what he's been doing his whole life. He adjusts. He steps back instinctively the same way he always has. This is not a calculated sacrifice. It is reflex. It is muscle memory. And that is exactly what makes this chapter so devastating. Jermaine Jackson's tragedy does not begin with fame or failure. It begins in a house where fear is routine and duty is mandatory, where love feels conditional and protection is a job assigned, not chosen. Long before the world compares him to Michael, long before critics call him the other brother, Jermaine's fate is already forming around him. He was never positioned to be the star. He was positioned to be the shield, the one who stands close, absorbs the impact, and makes sure the real prize survives. By the time Jermaine walks onto a stage for the first time, his role has already been locked in. Not the one who shines the brightest, not the one history will obsess over. He is the one who stays, the one who protects, the one who sacrifices quietly. And in a family built on fear and fierce ambition, that role will follow him for the rest of his life, shaping every decision, every loss, and every heartbreak that comes next. Watching Michael become different. The cruel twist is this: Jermaine Jackson did not get left behind because he failed. He got left behind because someone else became impossible to ignore. In 1969, when the Jackson 5 signed with Motown and moved to Los Angeles, Jermaine Jackson was not yet the overlooked brother people think of today. He was a central piece of the group's identity, singing lead on multiple tracks, playing bass with precision, grounding their performances with a steady confidence that made executives feel secure. In those first Motown sessions, Jermaine's voice was familiar, controlled, and steady, the kind of voice producers trusted to carry a song without surprises. For a brief moment, the spotlight felt shared, balanced, earned. But something began to shift in the rehearsal rooms and recording studios, long before it showed up in album credits or magazine covers. It started small, almost invisible, until it wasn't. Michael Jackson, still just a child, began to sound different. Not just good, not just gifted, but unnervingly precise. There was an emotional charge in his voice that could stop a room in mid-sentence. Producers noticed immediately. They leaned forward when he sang. They replayed his takes more often. They asked him to try lines again, not because he had made a mistake, but because they wanted to see how far he could push it. Jermaine noticed it too, standing only a few feet away, watching the room subtly rearrange itself around his younger brother without anyone ever announcing the change. Cameras started to linger a little longer on Michael's face. Interviewers shifted their questions toward him. Photo shoots quietly repositioned bodies so that Michael stood dead center. Nobody said Jermaine was being replaced. Nobody had to. The process was quiet, methodical, and relentless. What made it unbearable was that Jermaine had not done anything wrong. He didn't forget lyrics. He didn't drift off task. He didn't rebel, didn't storm out, didn't throw fits. He knew rebellion could fracture the fragile order that held his family together. So he did what he had always done. He adapted. He stepped half a pace back, let Michael drift naturally toward the center, and told himself this was temporary, that things would balance out again. But they never did. With each hit record, the distance widened, not necessarily in raw talent but in attention. In meeting rooms, producers now spoke to Michael first. In studios, suggestions were framed around Michael's voice. On stage, the loudest bursts of applause came when Michael stepped forward, while Jermaine's contribution slid into the background, essential but barely acknowledged. He watched his role dissolve in real time. It wasn't ripped from his hands in one dramatic scene. It was slowly reassigned inch by inch until one day he realized he was no longer being treated as a lead at all, but as support. And the most chilling part was how normal it seemed to everyone else. There were no screaming arguments, no family blow-ups, no decisive moment where Jermaine could point and say that's when it happened. Just a quiet drift that made him less central with every passing month. He did not lose his place in one night. He watched it move away from him gradually, as an industry locked onto something it had never seen before and refused to look away. For Jermaine, the pain wasn't rooted in Michael being extraordinary. It was rooted in the realization that once the world chose its legend, there was almost no room left for anyone else standing beside him. So Jermaine did what years of training had taught him to do. He swallowed the hurt. He straightened his shoulders. He stayed silent. He convinced himself that loyalty mattered more than recognition, even as the gap between himself and the spotlight solidified into something permanent. 1975, the decision that sealed his fate. If the early years were about slowly being nudged out of the spotlight, then 1975 was the year Jermaine Jackson effectively reached out and shut the door on himself, believing he was choosing loyalty and stability, when in reality, he was stepping into isolation. By the mid-1970s, the Jackson 5 were not just a hit group, they were leverage. A bargaining chip in a music industry that revolved around contracts and control. When Motown Records refused to grant them the creative freedom, they were demanding the brothers prepared to walk. The plan was simple: leave Motown sign with Epic Records and reinvent themselves on their own terms. Everyone left. Everyone except Jermaine Jackson. 2 years earlier, in 1973, Jermaine had married Hazel Gordy, daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy. That marriage was more than personal. It was layered with family politics, loyalty, and expectations Jermaine did not fully understand at the time. Walking away from Motown would not have been just a business decision. It would have felt like walking away from his wife's family, from the man whose label had given the Jacksons their first real shot, and from a sense of duty Jermaine had been trained to prioritize since childhood. So when the moment came in Los Angeles, in 1975, inside Motown offices, where careers had been built and futures were now being renegotiated, Jermaine stayed. He convinced himself that he was choosing the honorable path, that loyalty, love, and faith in his own talent would be enough to carry him forward as a solo artist. In that instant, he believed he could finally step out of Michael's shadow without betraying the people who had helped raise the Jackson name. The response from reality was swift and unforgiving. Almost overnight, Jermaine was cut off from the group's momentum, separated from the energy, visibility, and creative evolution that would soon transform his brothers into the Jacksons under a new label. He remained tethered to a company many insiders were already starting to view as yesterday's giant. The press began referring to him as the brother who stayed, a neutral phrase on the surface, but one that carried a quiet accusation. Over time, commentators and fans would look back and say this was the worst decision of his career, not because Jermaine lacked musical ability, but because in the entertainment world timing and proximity often matter more than principle. As the years rolled on, the marriage to Hazel came under strain. According to various reports, jealousy, pressure, and conflicting expectations chipped away at whatever stability Jermaine had hoped to secure. When the marriage finally ended in divorce, he was left without the family unity he had tried to protect and without the career advantage he thought his loyalty would guarantee. By the time the dust settled, the damage was permanent. A solo career under a shadow. That choice in 1975 flowed directly into the next phase of Jermaine's life, a solo career not defined by simple failure, but by something more suffocating: endless comparison. From 1976 through the late 1980s, Jermaine worked relentlessly between Los Angeles and New York. He recorded albums, went on the road, did press, and did the work most artists never get credit for: the unglamorous grind behind every release. On paper, his career looked solid. He had real hits. Let's Get Serious in 1980 became a genuine success, climbing the charts and proving that Jermaine could stand on his own musically. His voice, smooth, controlled, and confident, resonated with audiences. His stage presence was polished and sure. Any other artist with his resume would have been treated as a respected star. But every article, every review, every media appearance came packaged with the same unspoken label: not Michael. Critics praised his vocals, but almost always as slightly lesser than his younger brothers. His shows were called strong, but never as electric. His success was framed as impressive for Michael's brother, not simply impressive in its own right. Jermaine found himself trapped in a comparison loop. No matter what he achieved, it was weighed against something no one else in his generation could match: Michael Jackson at the peak of his powers. What made this period especially painful was the way Jermaine responded to it. Instead of lashing out, he stayed loyal. Instead of creating distance, he closed ranks. He refused to publicly tear Michael down, even when doing so might have helped him carve out a separate identity. As Michael's fame exploded into something mythic, Jermaine stood in interviews and defended him, redirecting questions away from rivalry and back toward family unity. People who spent time around Jermaine during these years later described a man exhausted by the constant comparisons, but unwilling to betray the same brother he had protected since childhood. He accepted being second quietly, not because it didn't hurt, but because fighting it would have meant breaking from the duty-driven persona he had carried since those long nights in Gary. The psychological toll was immense. Success without recognition doesn't build confidence. It erodes it. Jermaine lived in a strange limbo too, accomplished to be dismissed as irrelevant, yet too overshadowed to be fully celebrated. Each album felt like a test he could never truly pass. Each interview was a reminder that his story only mattered when Michael's name appeared beside it. Each performance became less about triumph and more about endurance. As years went by and controversies around Michael began to surface, Jermaine still chose loyalty. He stayed vocal in his support, even when that choice chipped away at his own credibility. The more he defended, the tighter the shadow grew. The tragedy of this era is not that Jermaine Jackson failed as a solo artist. It is that his achievements were drained of meaning by an industry and a culture that had already decided who the legend would be. He did the work. He showed up. He delivered. And still the reward never matched the effort. By the late 1980s, Jermaine Jackson was known everywhere but centered nowhere. Recognized but rarely revered. Successful but deeply unfulfilled, living proof that standing too close to greatness can lock you in its shadow forever. The decision he made in 1975 did not destroy him overnight. It sentenced him to something slower, quieter, and in many ways crueler, a lifetime of doing enough and still being told it wasn't. Defending Michael at all costs. If there was ever a moment when Jermaine Jackson could have stepped back and reclaimed his life, it disappeared the instant the world turned against his younger brother. From 1993 onward, Jermaine made a choice that would define everything that followed. If Michael was under attack, Jermaine would stand in front of him no matter the cost. In August 1993, when the first public allegations against Michael Jackson exploded across television screens and newspaper headlines, the entertainment industry froze. Sponsors pulled back. Longtime allies quietly stepped aside. Some pretended not to see what was happening. Jermaine walked straight into it. Within days, he was on television, in magazines, and on radio programs denouncing what he saw as a coordinated media assault. He accused journalists of sensationalism, insisted that his brother was being convicted in public before any facts had been proven, and rejected the idea of neutrality. He did not speak cautiously. He did not hedge. He spoke with absolute certainty, and he paid for it. Commentators who once acknowledged Jermaine as a respected legacy act began to portray him as biased, blindly loyal, even delusional. But Jermaine did not back off. For him, this was no longer about reputation management. It was about survival, not only Michael's, but his own sense of purpose. Every interview pulled him deeper into a role he now knew by heart: the shield. The more he defended, the more isolated he became from an industry that prefers distance when scandal hits. Silence might have preserved his image, but to Jermaine, silence would have felt like betrayal, and betrayal was a line he refused to cross. As the years moved forward, the scrutiny around Michael never fully disappeared. Jermaine remained on high alert, answering rumors, challenging tabloid narratives, and calling out broadcasters he believed were exploiting controversy for ratings. He accused parts of the media of racial bias and framed the coverage as a modern-day witch hunt. Some supporters admired his loyalty. Others quietly stopped calling. Invitations thinned out. Appearances were fewer and more conditional. Jermaine's name appeared most often in connection with Michael's legal troubles, not his own music or project. The more he spoke, the more his public identity collapsed into a single-role defender. By the time the 2005 trial began, Jermaine was no longer just a brother standing by. He was one of Michael's most visible shields, a familiar face outside the courthouse, repeating the same message over and over, that his brother was innocent and the system was broken. Public opinion split. Fatigue set in. But Jermaine had gone too far down this path to turn back. Any attempt to step away could have been seen as doubt, and he would not allow that even in his own mind. Behind the scenes, people close to him later described a man under relentless strain. He was worn down by the vigilance required to defend someone under constant attack, yet unable to stop because his identity had fused with Michael's survival. Every new headline felt like a personal blow. Jermaine sacrificed his remaining credibility without pause, aware that aligning himself so completely with Michael's defense would limit his own opportunities, yet convinced that his position as protector mattered more than anything the industry could offer. This wasn't a PR plan. It was the same instinct that had guided him as a child in Gary, stepping into the path of danger before asking whether it was sustainable. By the mid-2000s, his interviews followed a patterned, combative tone, no patience for opposing views, visible frustration with journalists demanding nuance. That rigidity pushed away potential allies who might have supported him as an individual artist rather than as a spokesperson. Still, Jermaine would not recalibrate. Admitting he had gone too far would have meant acknowledging that his life had become secondary to someone else's crisis, and that truth was too painful to face. When the 2005 trial ended and Michael tried to rebuild his career, Jermaine stayed on guard. He monitored coverage, responded to criticism, and framed any lingering doubt as proof that the persecution had never really stopped. The years blurred into a cycle of defense and disappointment. Until June 25, 2009. The day the phone rang and everything he had been holding together collapsed in a single sentence: Michael was gone. Jermaine was the one who identified the body. the one who stepped before cameras and confirmed the death to the world. His voice was controlled. His face was composed. But something behind his eyes looked permanently broken. In that moment, the full cost of his loyalty became impossible to ignore. He had tied his identity to his brother's survival, and now there was nothing left to protect. June 25, 2009, the day everything collapsed. For most people, June 25, 2009 is the day Michael Jackson died. For Jermaine Jackson, it was the day the last structure holding his life together finally gave way. Because this was never just about losing a sibling. It was about losing the central purpose around which his entire existence had been organized. The call came in the afternoon. Sudden. Disbelief. Years of defense, denial, and vigilance shattered by a few words on a phone line. When Jermaine arrived at the hospital, the chaos was already sealed behind doors, doctors moving with controlled urgency, staff avoiding his eyes, a heavy, suffocating silence in the hallway that said more than any explanation. Jermaine was asked to identify the body. In a sterile room under harsh fluorescent lights, he stood over the still figure of the brother he had spent his life shielding. In that room, he wasn't a former Motown star or a media defender. He was simply an older brother staring at a silence he could not interrupt. Witnesses later described Jermaine as unusually controlled. His expression fixed, his posture straight. He didn't break down in front of the staff. But from everything known about his past, collapsing had never really been an option. Not as a boy in Gary, not as a grown man in front of cameras, and not on the day the world demanded composure more than ever. Hours later, Jermaine walked out in front of microphones at UCLA Medical Center and told the world what it did not want to hear. His tone was calm, measured, almost detached as he announced Michael Jackson's death. That image, Jermaine delivering the words that ended an era, would become part of the permanent visual archive of pop culture. In the days that followed, grief expanded into something more destabilizing. With Michael gone, Jermaine did not just lose family. He lost function. For more than a decade, his role had been clear: defend, shield, correct, push back. That role had given his life shape and direction. Now it disappeared without warning and without replacement. The media that once framed him as a defender now treated him as a witness, a surviving character in a story that no longer needed protecting. The questions shifted from accusations to memories, from defense to nostalgia. And Jermaine was left in a reality where loyalty no longer had a living target. Public memorials, a comeback show that never happened, and an ocean of global mourning created a level of noise that left very little room for Jermaine's private grief. Once again, he was expected to be composed, available, and strong, even as the core of his identity crumbled beneath the surface. According to people who knew him during this period, Jermaine wrestled with insomnia, guilt, and a deep sense of unfinished duty. He replayed moments from decades earlier, wondering if anything he had done had actually changed the outcome. The defender had survived the war, but there was nothing left to defend. Financial complications, estate battles, and constant speculation quickly followed, layering stress and confusion over the grief. Jermaine, who had spent years sacrificing his own standing to protect his brother, now found himself navigating a system focused less on loyalty and more on legality and profit. The irony was brutal. Michael's death lifted his legend into a new, untouchable sphere. Jermaine's presence faded even further into the margins, his contributions reduced to footnotes in a narrative too massive for nuance. From that day forward, Jermaine Jackson was no longer the defender at the gates. He was the one left alive, carrying memories no one else could fully understand, and a silence heavier than any accusation he had ever tried to refute. June 25, 2009 didn't just end Michael's life. It ended the version of Jermaine Jackson who had been holding himself together for decades. What came next wasn't a dramatic fall, but something far more chilling, a slow recognition that the role he had built his entire existence around had died too, leaving him alone with a future he had never prepared to live. Financial struggles and quiet humiliation. From the outside, people assumed Jermaine Jackson would be fine. The Jackson name still sounded like money, security, and endless privilege. But that assumption became the setup for the next cruel chapter. Starting around 2010, Jermaine entered a period shaped less by public meltdown and more by quiet financial suffocation, the kind that unfolds behind closed doors while the world assumes you're still protected. Tax issues surfaced. Debts accumulated. Lawsuits appeared with uncomfortable regularity. Court documents and reports painted a picture of a man whose expenses and obligations far outpaced his incoming opportunities. Legacy, it turned out, did not automatically equal liquidity. Jermaine was no longer pulling in steady income from major tours or hit records. Work offers dried up more quickly than the bills. Legal fees, child support and obligations from past relationships, and the everyday costs of maintaining even a modest public lifestyle in Los Angeles piled up while the phone rang less and less with meaningful gigs. What made it especially humiliating was the disbelief that surrounded it. Many people heard Jackson and assumed wealth. Creditors and courts did not. By the mid-2010, as Jermaine's name appeared in articles and legal filings connected to money disputes and estate tensions, placing him back in the headlines, not as an artist, but as a complication. To some observers, he looked less like a music veteran and more like a financial problem that needed managing. The sting was sharp. He had spent decades defending Michael without hesitation, often to his own detriment. Now, even in the aftermath, he was tangled in systems he couldn't control, struggling to stay afloat, while the world continued to imagine he was sheltered by a fortune that had never really been his. This was not a dramatic collapse in the tabloids. It was something worse: prolonged instability, hidden beneath a famous last name wrapped in public misunderstanding. Asking for sympathy was almost impossible because hardly anyone believed he needed it. Family collapse and personal loss. If financial pressure wore down Jermaine's sense of safety, the slow unraveling of his personal life pulled apart the last pieces of his identity outside of music. Through the 2000s and 2010s, Jermaine's private world was marked by repeated fractures, multiple marriages, multiple divorces, and relationships that, according to various accounts, could not survive the strain of history, expectations, and unresolved pain. What began as hope often ended in bitterness, mistrust, or quiet distance. Each breakup left behind both emotional and financial scars. Children grew up, some drifted away, and communication thinned. Family gatherings, where they existed at all, became tense or rare. Little by little, it seemed that the loyalty Jermaine had so freely given throughout his life was no longer something he could count on in return. Public perception shifted in the background. Where he was once viewed simply as part of music royalty, he became, in the eyes of many, a side character in a story that revolved around someone else's legend. People who knew Jermaine during this period described a man increasingly isolated, worn down by years of carrying responsibility without receiving much protection himself. The cruel symmetry of his life became inescapable. He had spent decades stepping between danger and the people he loved, but when his own life began to come apart, no one stepped in front of him. There were no shields left for Jermaine, no public figures rushing to reframe his story, no system built to reward a lifetime of quiet sacrifice. As personal ties frayed, the emotional cost cut deeper than any unpaid bill, because it forced him to confront something he had avoided for most of his life: that sacrifice does not guarantee connection, and devotion does not guarantee that anyone will be there when you finally need help. At 71, still alive but erased. By the time Jermaine Jackson entered his 70s, the tragedy of his survival was impossible to ignore. He was not remembered as a villain nor as a spectacular cautionary tale. He was something more unsettling: a man who had simply faded out of focus. From around 2020 onward, Jermaine's appearances became rare. When he did sit for an interview or show up in public, there was a fragility to him, a reflective, slowed-down version of the young man who once anchored stages with steady confidence. His answers were calm but tired, punctuated by long silences and careful wording, as if he were constantly silently sorting through which memories were safe to expose. More often than not, he talked about Michael. He revisited old moments, defended his brother's legacy, and instinctively slipped back into the role of guardian, even though there was no crisis left to manage. What stood out most was how little space he left for himself in those conversations. His own achievements, his own pain, his own losses were pushed into the background. It was as if even in old age, Jermaine did not fully believe his story mattered on its own terms. Meanwhile, the culture moved on. New stars rose. New scandals came and went. Younger generations recognized the last name Jackson, but many of them could not clearly say who Jermaine was or what he had done. And that is where his tragedy sharpens to a point. Jermaine Jackson did not crash in flames. He did not vanish in a spectacular scandal. He endured. He survived. And in surviving, he lived long enough to be half forgotten. At 71, he stands as a quiet reminder that not all losses are sudden, and not all tragedies end with headlines. Some unfold slowly over decades, through loyalty, silence, and a lifetime spent standing next to someone the world has chosen to immortalize. Until one day, you realize history will always remember the legend who died young and barely glanced at the brother who stayed behind and carried the weight of it all. Looking back over Jermaine Jackson's life, what cuts deepest is not one bad choice or a single missed opportunity. It is the steady buildup of sacrifices that were never truly returned. He gave his childhood to discipline, his youth to loyalty, his career to the shadow of another man's spotlight, his adulthood to defending a brother the world both adored and dismantled. Now in old age there is no dramatic redemption, no perfect comeback, no final twist that sets everything right. There is only a quiet man living with memories that weigh more than any fame ever did. Jermaine did not fail loudly. He endured quietly, and that endurance cost him nearly everything people still assume he has. So ask yourself, is survival always a victory, or can surviving become its own kind of punishment? Was Jermaine Jackson simply unlucky, or was he trapped by loyalty in a world that only truly rewards the ones who are willing to walk away? If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.